Hello and welcome to Session 1 and Track 2 of the 44th Internationalization and Unicode Conference. I'm Mike McKenna, and this session is on CLDR, What's in a Personal Name. I've been doing globalization for a long time, and I'm currently a globalization, or we say a world-ready leader at PayPal. Let's go on with the session. CLDR, so what's in a personal name? So names are used in applications in all different contexts. Everything from you deciding who you are and how you should be referred to creating mail merge to send out information to you in emails and letters. Human resources uses them to keep track of you and be able to present to you in a way that you prefer. Onboarding to applications, governments, know your customer, and so on. All have to deal with names to identify who you are and present how you would like to be identified. There's a number of different standards out there, so maybe they can help. Three very common ones are LDAP, hcard, and HTML. HTML defined by W3C, and present on the right side the standard autofill fields that are used in HTML. And these are what are used to automatically fill forms when you go to buy something online and filling in various information when they're presented to you. And they should look familiar. Prefix, given name, additional name or middle name, family name, suffix, and nickname. But there's a number of issues with names. They can be presented all kinds of different ways. Which name comes first? First name, last name? How do you present it to Mr., Mrs., Ms., or nothing at all? Which initials to use? How many initials? Is there a middle name, or should it just be a middle initial? Are legal names supposed to be represented a certain way? And then there's informal names and nicknames. How should those be handled? So real names have got different lengths depending on the context and how they're being used. So we'll take a look at some different names. So in Europe, there's a name like Jonas Salk. And depending on the context, it could be represented with very different lengths. Could be you want a full length, you want a medium, short, initial, any number of different formats and how it could be presented. Spanish names also have to deal with length, although it's slightly different. Looking at a famous person, Diego Rivera, his nickname is Panzon, if some happen to know that. But if you're dealing with his legal name, it's not Diego Rivera, but it's Diego Rivera Barrientos, or his full name, Señor Diego Maria Rivera Barrientos. If he's filling in his name on an official government form, it's required to be able to enter two last names or two surnames, the primer apellido and the segundo apellido. So usually the father's surname followed by the mother's surname. Names come in different orders as well. Is the surname first or family name or the given name first? Taking a look at some Japanese names. This is a name that should be familiar to you. It's Shinzo Abe, or here in Japanese it's Abe Shinzo. And in Latin, it would be, for instance, His Excellency Shinzo Abe. So the prefix, the title, it comes at the beginning in a Latin context and at the end in a Japanese context. Names are presented differently as well depending on the formality of the context. Let's take a name such as Albert. Albert could be Dr. Schweitzer. It could be Herr Dr. Schweitzer. It could be Herr Dr. Albert Schweitzer, MD. So if I were speaking to him in a formal setting, I would refer to him as Dr. Schweitzer, Herr Dr. Schweitzer, not as Albert. In Japanese, let's look at a fairly common name, this Keiko Matsui. Keiko is a fairly popular Japanese musician, and her name would be represented differently depending on, again, on the context. If you know her really, really well, you would refer to her as Keiko-chan. In a normal context, Matsui-san as your teacher, Matsui-sensei, and as your superior or your boss, Matsui-sama. So it looks like there is a formality aspect to deal with as well. Some names you have to deal with in terms of the usage. So the most common form that we look at today is the nominative form. It's a name in a list. A name that is Robert Jones. That is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That is Matsui Keiko. That is Peter Tuteo. That's a name that's on a list, a name on a label, a name on an envelope. But if you're talking not about someone, but to someone, there's a vocative case. How do you speak to them? If it's informal, it might be Hi Bob or Spasiba Sasha, Sasha the nickname for Alexander. In a more formal case, it might be Matsui-san konnichiwa, or for Peter Tutea, it might be Salut domnule Tutea in Romanian to say hello, Mr. Tutea. So, and then if you want to sort the names in a more formal context, it might be by surname followed by given name. In an informal context, given name first followed by surname, again depending on the region. So it looks like we have a usage axis or context to deal with. Now there's some fun ways in which names appear in real life. One is mononyms. If you're in Indonesia, you don't put in your first name, last name, your given name, surname, just nama lengkap, your full name, just one field for however many names you want to put down. And many people have only one name, like this individual, Hassan. This is common in Indonesia, in southern India, and there's a few celebrities that have legally changed their name to just one name. There's also the aspect of patronymic names or lineage names, names that are derived based on your father and mother. In Russia, every person is required by law to put down a patronymic name that is derived usually from a father, could be from a mother if they don't have a father. So his name, Fadorovich, family name, such as Vladimir Antonovich Ivanov. Then there are matronymic names. We'll take a look at Iceland. So Iceland has your typical patronymic name where it's his name, father's son. So if you have Jon and his father's name is Einar, it'd be Jon Einarsson. But then you have women who will take their name from their mother. So her name, mother's dóttir, such as Guthrun Menuvusdóttir. So you have different ways in which the names are combined together, depending on the context, if it's from the mother, from the father, and so on. Some other areas have ancestral names. One example, Saudi Arabia. So if you have a name like Farah bint Faudi bin Sajid al-Tikriti, you would have to fill in official government forms. This is from the Saudi Arabia for a change of address form. You would enter your first name, and this is Farah, who is the daughter of her father Fadi, who has the grandfather of bin Sajid and her family al-Tikriti. She might be referred to as Farah al-Tikriti or Farah bint Fadi al-Tikriti, or any combination of these names, again, depending on the context. So some standards handle these well, some don't, in terms of just being able to store the information. The industry standards available, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, all have their own concept of a person object. Apple and Microsoft have got a contacts object with name structure in it. Google and Facebook have a person object, also with names. All four of them have got some concept of a phonetic name as well to handle the Japanese case or the Chinese case. And also, as you get farther down into more details in where an industry or an organization pays a particular attention to names, can get much more complex. On the open source side, OASIS and the Universal Postal Union have got very complex standards that go to a high level of detail in terms of a generation indicator, whether it's a junior, first, second, the third, followed by a various suffix attributes. Trulio and Workday deal more with human resources. Workday with human resources, Trulio with identity verification. So they have to have a bit more detail that will match closer to official government documents. So if you take a look at the standards that are available, they provide a tremendous amount of flexibility to be able to move data around in an effective way. But they do not give you any information in what order the fields are in for each region and language. They give you no information for what to choose for different lengths. They don't give you information on what presentation form to use for a different formality context. They also don't give you information about how to sort it or how to use it in different cases, a nominative or vocative case. A group from a number of different companies have come together and are putting together a proposal to pass to CLDR to represent names. First part is to define a standard, concise set of fields that are flexible and work well with W3C. And one of the design aspects is to be sure it has a high degree of usability for developers and usability for the end user. It also takes into consideration these three axes for context: the length, the formality, and the usage. And following CLDR conventions, proper syntax and structure, skeletons or templates for most usages, and fallback mechanism if skeletons are missing, and then to use locales to dictate script-specific behavior, script or language-specific behavior. What it does not do is tell you if a field is valid or not, what fields are required, and doesn't handle linguistic inflections. Let's take a look at the fields. They should again look familiar. Prefix, like Mr., Mrs., Doctor, Professor. Given, middle, surname, like your first name, middle name, family names. Surname extended to handle second last name for Hispanic and Spanish and Portuguese. Ancestral names for Arabic. Suffix, so you can handle generation indicators like junior, the third, or professional titles. Nickname, how a person prefers to be referred to in a more informal sense, like Jack, Venki, or Sasha. And then the idea behind monograms is that they would be programmatically determined, but an individual may not like the way the program puts it together. So an idea for a monogram override that someone can put into their context or their contact fields or whatever to override how the program decides to put it together. Let's look at some of the context axes. First one is length. So the fields or the attributes we thought of initially is full, long, medium, short, which have matched the context that we have for the members on the team from Apple, Microsoft, Google, PayPal. And also monogram that you might have for 2 or 3 letters, and monogram narrow that you have in various chat sessions that may be just a single letter. A formality context. We know about informal and formal, so those are part of the attributes. The usage, nominative and vocative case, whether you're talking about someone or they're in a list, or vocative if you're talking to someone. And then sorting. How do you want to sort someone in a formal context, an informal context, perhaps a legal context, etc. Then these are put together in LDML, which is the Locale Data Markup Language, XML structure that is set up through the Unicode consortium and is dictated or spec'd out in UTS number 35. And then defining the structure, what the default layouts would be based on context. And then those layouts are determined by the skeletons or templates, an example of which is the following. person name. So this would be an example for English. For context, a skeleton of length of full, usage nominative, and style formal, which in English would be presented with prefix, given, middle, surname, and suffix. Pretty much the whole name except the nickname. I don't expect you to read all of this, but this would be an example of a fairly fleshed out set of skeletons for a particular locale. I chose English since I know that one. And this would show the formal context near the top, then the informal, and then down to, from the nominative down towards the bottom with the vocative, which also need to be fleshed out from there. You'll also see towards the bottom, monogram narrow, and a structure for being able to represent an initials, like given initial, surname initial, to be able to represent the expectation that it would be the first letter of that particular name field. But what if a skeleton can't be found? There are over 200 different locales, or hundreds of locales in CLDR at this point, and not all of them have all of the different formats that are spec'd out in CLDR. So what if a skeleton can't be found? So length would fall back to medium. So from the longer fields to medium, and from the shorter ones also back to medium. An example where this might hold true, going back again to Japanese, would be in alphabetic regions, a monogram would again be the first letter of the given name and the first letter of the surname. In Japanese or Chinese, that would be absolutely incorrect, to take the first character of one name and the first character of another name. So if it fell back to short in an informal basis, maybe the given name. If it falls back to short in a formal basis, it would be the surname. And that would be the appropriate thing to represent to the individual in Chinese or Japanese. If the usage is missing, it would fall back to the nominative case, which would be when you're talking about someone or in a list. That would hold true for sorting or for the vocative or speaking to someone. For the style, it would fall back to informal. So if the formal case was missing, we would fall back to the informal case, which seems to be more common than others in web applications today. So there are unique cases, and how do we handle these? So we mentioned the Japanese before, where a name would be represented in the Chinese kanji as well as hiragana, but it's also expected on a regular basis for Japanese to enter their name how it would be pronounced in the katakana. In Chinese, this would be the pinyin. Then for international use, if the name has to go onto a passport or perhaps an international credit card, the name would have to be represented in Latin. So how would we do that? So the idea would be you'd have different name objects for each language and script. So looking at an example for Japanese identity, you have the various person name objects that could then be represented by the different skeletons for kanji, for kana, and for romaji. And then those three can be used to be able to build up presentation forms for input forms, as well as how to represent them to be displayed and represented to the user or into lists and so on. So the current status for the project, we're preparing for submission to the Unicode Consortium. And we hope to submit a PRI for review during the CLDR 39 cycle. We still need to finalize some use cases and edge cases to be sure it holds water for a wide range of different uses in the world in different locales, languages, and regions. Things that we'll need to consider and have answers for is how would name types be handled, such as a birth name, a legal name, preferred name, and these we feel would just be different name objects. How would we handle casing, such as in Japan, the government has asked that the Latin representation of Japanese names should have the surname first with the surname capitalized. Do we need to deal with generation versus honorific names like J. Jones Jr. versus J. Jones Jr. PhD? We feel that those could just be used as different presentation forms or name objects, and they would just go into a suffix field. Name prefixes. Some complex standards would take strings such as Vande, Dela, such as in De La Salle, or Vande and Vanderpool, or Bin, as in Bin Abdallah, as separate fields. But for the sake of usability, we wanted to keep this concise and interoperable with W3C, and we feel these will do fine inside the name fields themselves within the surname or additional name fields. Some of the complex standards have the concept of joint names, and we feel that with the proposal that we have, such as Sue and John Jones, joint tenants with right of survivorship, the Sue and John could be dropped into a given name field in this context. If that needs to change, we'll get some feedback on that. And how would we handle Arabic ancestral names? We feel we have enough name fields to be able to handle that well, although it may require some juggling once we get feedback from the various regions that are in place. So I wanted to say thank you, but before we do, when you get the PDF, go to the back of it if you so desire. At the very end, there's a discussion comparing the CLDR proposal, the various fields, compared to other standards, compared to industry standards, compared to various government standards, and then a set of references you can see for in reference to standards, to regulatory, to industry, and then a number of Wikipedia and other sources. So with that, we will now say thank you. That takes us to the end. The core CLDR personal names team has been composed of Mark Davis, Google, Peter Edberg and Rick Gillum at Apple, Alex Koleshenko and Christy Lee at Microsoft, and myself. And if you notice, I gave the skeleton for sorting on the bottom. I hope we have time for questions, and let's go there now.